Hey, friends, welcome to another episode of Shift Happens. I am your host and lead pastor of an open and affirming church here in Gainesville, Florida called Shift Church. And I'm excited about today's episode because I have with me Thomas and Alexa Oord. Thomas is a theologian and author and speaker. He has written several books, but one personally for me that punched me in the gut and made me rethink everything I thought I knew about God was the book God Can't. And he and his daughter Alexa are leading the charge to create an inclusive space within the Nazarene denomination. So I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time and being part of this.
Thanks for the opportunity to chat, Joe.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm curious, how did all of this come about? Alexa, I know that you're part of the LGBTQ plus community, and and then Tom, I know your background. I can't remember exactly if you're an ordained deacon within the church itself. I don't remember the
Yeah, I'm an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene.
elder. Thank you. So I'm sure that there was a process that led to where you all are now. Alexa, would you speak into that? Like, how did this come about? Where did this start?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, the story begins long before I was even born, in fact. So actually, I'll kick it over to Tom to give us
Okay.
a little backstory, and then I'll jump in on how the book itself sort of came to be.
Okay.
Well, I think Alexa's referring to the process I went through to become a fully affirming person. And that was way back in the early 1990s when I was in seminary, in which I, had in those days, it was called the homosexual question.
Yes.
And so I did a bunch of research with some friends and came to change my views on these things to be what we now call affirming. Um, and then had to make a decision. Okay, do I stay in a denomination that's not affirming, that doesn't seem to be any time in the horizon going to be becoming affirming, or should I leave and go elsewhere? And decided that I should stay, that I could be a voice within the denomination, although I'd have to be quiet at least for a while and try to work subversively, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of began a career as a professor of theology and talked with students who came to college with these questions. Some of them were queer themselves, others had friends and family members who were queer. And as I worked through those issues and questions, became even more convinced that the way of love was a way of full embrace. And ended up having three daughters, my wife and I. Alexa's our middle daughter, and eventually kind of presenting these things to her and her sisters, and they make their own decisions, obviously. But is that kind of what you had in mind, Alexa, as the background?
Sure. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your trial with the Church of the
Oh, gotcha.
Nazarene.
Yeah, and then in late, let's see, my years are getting mixed up. Late 2021, a group from the Midwest in my denomination registered charges against me in my local district. And some of them were theological, and those had no teeth to them. But the one that did have some real teeth was that I am an affirming person in a denomination that's not affirming.
How dare you, sir?
I know it. So then I went before a bunch of people and defended myself. I had to answer questions. The correct term is not a trial, but it had all the trappings of a trial. I've forgotten what the correct term is for what I went through, but it was basically I had to answer questions in front of a jury, a committee of people who then make a recommendation on whether or not I ought to be disciplined. And so I wrote this long document. And instead of kind of saying, well, kind of making a defense, you ought to include me, even though I'm not fully on board, I played offense. I said, the denomination needs to change its views. It needs to be fully affirming, and here are the reasons why: theological, sociological, etc. And that event, I was not officially disciplined, which was a surprise to many people, although my district superintendent did take away some responsibilities from me. And so then, Alexa, why don't you pick it up there?
Sure. Yeah. So after the trial, even though, Tom was officially cleared, we were still kind of, as a family and as a church community, at this point where, like, what do we do now? Do we just sort of disappear quietly into the background, or do we try and, take a more vocal stand? And so then Tom and I, just in sort of conversation, Tom brought this idea to me of doing sort of a collected book of essays. And really the idea was to, get a wide group of voices that more so than just one person's opinion or argument for being affirming. Instead, we wanted to do the approach of, okay, there's this sort of silent mass of people who are affirming or who are queer in the church, that their stories, don't really have a platform yet.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom approached me, even though, I have left the church, I'm not religious anymore, but he and I have worked together on some other books. And I have a degree in gender studies. And so it was kind of a perfect coming together of our two worlds, a little collaborative project. So yeah, and then we started working on this. We put out a call for essays in maybe November of last year, and the book was published in April. So it was a real quick out the door, and the response has really just been amazing. We ended up with over 90 essays in the book.
Yeah, when Tom sent it to me and I started diving into it, I honestly thought, I thought it was going to be not a pamphlet's not the right word. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was going to be short, but it's a book. It's a full on, like, thick, meaty, like, and the stories that are in there, I mean, the scholarship is excellent and I didn't expect any less, but what hit me the most was the stories that you guys were able to collect, and that people were sharing like they were sharing.
Absolutely. Once we started sort of putting out a first call for essays, then it sort of like proliferated beyond our initial list, and they sent out more friends and reached out to, I think this person might want to be included. And people were really just coming out of the woodwork of finally giving a chance to share their stories.
I think when we went into it, we really didn't know how the book was going to shape out. We obviously didn't know how many essays we were going to have. I think we guessed at 40, and then we ended up having 90 some. But we didn't really know how we were going to organize them. We knew who were some likely writers, but folks the word got passed around. People came out of the woodwork. And we eventually saw that the essays could be roughly divided into what we called queer narratives,
Mm-hmm.
ally perspectives, and then scholarly perspective, or something like that. And there's, some of the scholars are queer, so that didn't quite work, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Those were the kind of three major categories.
Now, the thought behind that, how did that come about? Like, what was the thought process of that? Like, okay, we're going to put this thing together. The hope is to create more awareness, I mean, just what was the thought process of creating the book?
Sure.
Well,
yeah. So
go for it, Alexa.
Yeah, so I did a large amount of the like actual editing process, as far as editing each essay and then organizing them. And as we were sort of reading them all, it kind of emerged that it wouldn't quite make sense to organize them by topic, because you don't want to read 5 essays in a row talking about the same biblical passages, and instead how we arrived at where we did is, from the beginning, in sort of Tom's and my planning conversations about what we wanted this book to do, we really wanted to prioritize making space for queer voices and putting them at the forefront, and so that was something we cared about deeply. And so that kind of became, okay, well, let's put that front and center at the very beginning. If you open this book, to the first page, you're going to be confronted with the truth of what the church has done, and it's not buried away. It's you can't deny this, sort of testimony of queer voices.
Yeah, I think of it kind of like what's the big, broad purpose or goal, and then what are like sub goals underneath that.
Mm-hmm.
So, like for me, the big, broad goal is I want to live a life of love. And I think the full inclusion of LGBTQ plus people is a living a life of love. And I think the Church of the Nazarene, of which I'm an ordained elder, our primary purpose is to be loving people. And so we ought to have an approach to queer issues that is loving, which is not what we currently have. So that was kind of the big overarching goal. And then sort of the subcategories, as Alexa said, we wanted to give people who were queer a prominent voice. We wanted to let allies come out and say, we're allies, and we also think the churches ought to change. We wanted scholars to say, you know, the way people have been reading scripture or the way they've been thinking theologically, there's a better way to think about this. And then maybe even further down the scale of like macro to micro, our denomination has a general assembly in which delegates from all around the world come together once every 4 years, I believe it is. And that assembly was in June. So we wanted to have a book out prior to that assembly so that we could have some influence on the conversation. So that was kind of a strategic goal, you might say.
So did you were you able to accomplish that? I mean, you got the book out. Did it make the impact that you were hoping it was going to make?
Well, the way things work in the denomination, to change a rule or to change what we think needs to be changed, it takes going through a district assembly and then a proposal. And we were way too late for that sort of thing. But we thought that we could affect the conversation about the proposals that were on the table, and also just kind of generally raise awareness in the denomination that there are queer voices and queer allies. And in that respect, I think we did make a real impact.
What do you think, Alexa? I want your opinion too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so Tom was able to attend General Assembly, which was really great. One of the greatest parts of that I only, saw on Facebook because I couldn't go, was we had a meetup of a bunch of queer people, affirming people, and people who contributed to the book. And it was a great sort of like coming together. We've been talking via email and the conference and reading each other's stories for so long. And then to have all of them come together is really great. For me to see that, especially. And, we definitely sort of caused a bit of a stir, or, got the conversation going, which was definitely what we wanted of I think so much in the Church of the Nazarene, there's a real silence around this issue. There are some people who are very vocally homophobic, but on the large part, it's just something we don't talk about. And I think this book, both at General Assembly and in other sort of instances in the church, has just been sort of bringing this conversation to the forefront and sort of putting people on the spot to say, are you affirming? Declare right now. Don't keep it a secret. We need you to come out.
I like that. Now, I wanted to back up just a second because I had a couple of questions for both of you when it came to this trial thing. And you're talking about, being an ordained elder and the church and the community there. That's part of it. Am I assuming correctly when, if you're an ordained elder and you've been affirming since the 90s, I would assume that your local leadership at least knew of that position, correct?
I would say they suspected it, but I wasn't, out in the front lines marching or anything like that.
When did that change? At what point did that begin to change and you begin to take more of a, vocal out front role?
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the things I've been wrestling with for 20 plus years. What's the appropriate role for a person to take in this conversation if they have convictions like me? And if you're a person who wants to be on the inside to try to change a conversation, that's a different way of talking and strategizing and being than if you were on the outside. And so for a long time, I was an insider, a theologian working at the university, in the church, working with young people, advancing this conversation, helping them, I think making a real difference, but not posting on Facebook, not doing things like that. And then in 2015, I lost my job at the university, and that changed my strategy. Now, all of a sudden, I wasn't the insider. And so I could be much more vocal, more public, go say things on Facebook, etc. So my position in the denomination changed. So that then made me think I need a new strategy.
Mm-hmm. Now, Alexa, I'm curious because you're his daughter and you're watching all of this, you're watching dad go through all this and do all this stuff. And feel free to tell me to jump off a cliff or whatever, to not answer anything I ask, you know what I mean? But, being part of the queer community and all of the people that I've talked to, how that process goes, especially when you add in church and religion, and how that can really complicate, and honestly, most of the time just is kind of harmful. How did you go through all of this with him?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our story is a little bit unique in that I didn't leave the church for this reason, and I have never my parents have always been affirming of me. I didn't go through sort of the classic coming out to your parents, internal strife. It just feels like kind of a separate thing from my personal experience, but I know that that's not true for so many folks. So then, obviously seeing my dad and having our family go through these trials was really emotional, and it was a lot going on, but it also, was a real moment that I was just, and I still am so proud of my dad, of, the stance that he took. And I think also what makes it especially meaningful to me is that, I think often people become affirming because they know someone who's queer that changes their mind, and I think that's a really valuable and very common way to become affirming. And I think that sometimes, do you know the whole sort of trope of like, oh, well, I couldn't be sexist because I have a mother.
Yeah.
The sort of idea that the only reason why you would support women, or in this case queer people, is because you know someone.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it of your own volition. So it's kind of nice in my case that it didn't feel like my dad was necessarily fighting for me, because I had already left the church. I wasn't really, technically a part of this community, but this was out of his own passion and commitment to this issue. So it just was really a moment of pride. And I was so glad that we then got to do this book together to really bring me back into that sort of conversation with him. And it's been such a great part of our relationship.
That's awesome. I love all of that. I think for most people, and I'm going to broad stroke it here, but I can remember back in my, just straight evangelical days, I didn't know, well, I don't know if I did, but I didn't actively know any queer people, because they were this thing over here, right? And we were told that they were this thing. And so I think a lot of people that we're still, connected's the wrong word anymore, but that we knew are still in that space. And I know that there's a lot of like misconceptions and a lot of misunderstandings, whether they mean to or not. There's a lot of that happening, and it's a topic, right? It's a topic to talk about or debate instead of humanity, people that are harming. And so, from your point of view, Alexa, when an entire denomination is talking about this, bringing your dad in front of a trial, could you speak to that a little bit, just on a human level, for anybody that's listening, what that feels like, that, an entire denomination, a group or organization, or for instance, we're in Florida, freaking state governments, decide that, hey, we're going to target you because of this thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really awful thing, and it results in so much trauma. And I think you can really see that in so many of the stories in the first and second sections of the book, that the harm being done by churches, states, whoever, passing these sorts of laws is very tangible. It's concrete, it's real, and it's harm, it's trauma. And I think also, oh, lost my train of thought. We'll see if it comes back to me. Oh, I remember. Here we are. Yes, I think that one thing that you mentioned, Joe, that I think is so important is that so often having these conversations, the way that straight people will talk about it is, yes, about them over there. We're talking about the LGBTQ people without realizing that whether or not we're going to accept them into our church, they're already in your church. Queer people are all around you, and it's not that you need to welcome them in, it's that you need to learn to open your eyes and your heart so that they feel like welcome to talk to you. And I think that can be a real shift. A way to practice shifting your mind is to, when you're talking about this issue, sort of change your language, change the way that you're phrasing things and framing things about we are bringing our community, our family, our queer family into more, to feel welcome in this church, as opposed to, okay, we're going to make this shift where now all of a sudden queer people are coming in. No. They've been there all along.
Oh, that's the truth. That's the truth. Tom, I'm curious, when you were brought before this religious tribunal or, judge, court, whatever it's called, was there any, because I'm a dad, I've got 2 kids, and if there was some sort of state board or whatever that, are accusing me of things that where my daughter's identity was wrapped up in that. And, I've got a daughter, she's 21. I think that, I would kind of take that a little personally, maybe. And it's not just a topic, but you're talking about my family. Was there any of that involved for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, that obviously when you have friends and family who are queer, you want to stand up for them. At least I do. But I have to say that my decision to be affirming, which was way back in the early 90s, it was not this, I don't know how to say this without sounding weird. Earlier you said when you were in the church, when you were younger, you really didn't think that you knew anybody who was queer. You probably did, but people weren't out of the closet. Back in the early 90s, I knew very few people who were queer, and the person I did know the best is a person who's a jerk. I mean, I just don't like the person. And so, like, I had no personal reasons to want to be affirming because of my relationship with this one queer person. I changed my mind based on theology. Changed my mind based on what I believed God was like and how I read the scriptures. And that's unique. Most people, that's not the tack they take. So when these charges were brought against me and I had to meet with this group and they had to decide whether or not they would recommend me to be disciplined. I did think about people who are now my friends who are queer, but I'd already had this theological reason for that undergirds my reason for being affirming. And I've been affirming and I've been believing that for 30 years.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because that's kind of our journey as well. We didn't have anybody come out to us. There wasn't anybody that was like, friends or whatever. It was purely theological and just kind of seeing, the harm that the church was creating. And like, so I get exactly what you're saying. For me, it was like, I'm going to start reading these things, and where they take me, they take me. And then it wasn't a very long journey before I discovered, hey, these foundational air quotes, beliefs that I had before just really don't hold the water that I thought they did. And so I completely understand that. So you guys have put together this book of essays. 90 different people have written and been a part of it. And your hope is, kind of creating this conversation within the Church of the Nazarene. How has it been received? You mentioned that you kind of were able to kind of influence some of the conversations in the June, I forgot what it's called.
General Assembly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But how has it been received? I mean, it's now, we're recording this in late June of 23. So what's been going on with it?
I don't know. Should we just share anecdotes, Alexa? You want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have been really lucky in that because I live in New York and I'm not on paper connected to the Church of the Nazarene anymore, I guess through the literal paper of this book, but
Right.
I've been really insulated from any of this sort of blowback, any negativity. I haven't experienced any of it, so it's been great.
That's okay.
But my main sort of engagement with the reaction that has been so wonderful is through a Facebook group that we created for all of the contributors and then various friends. And it was just sort of grown into this such a wonderful community of affirming and queer people to, share their own experiences. Many of them, writing in this book was their first time sort of publicly coming out as affirming to their congregations, to their pastor, to their family and friends. And so, times of heartache, times of joy, it's really been just such a great place to connect and to build those relationships with people, with a community that I haven't been a part of in years. It's been a nice sort of way to come back and find out that there is still a place for me in this Nazarene adjacent world, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah, I'm going to, instead of starting with the positive, I'm going to start with the negative. And I'll just say, Joe, there are people listening to this right now who listen to every podcast I do and then send notes to the leadership in my denomination, quoting me, trying to get me kicked out. So
That's
there are
fun.
people listening right now who are going to take whatever we've said and they're going to alert my district superintendent, general superintendents. There's people out to get me. There's no doubt about that. That is not fun. It's also not fun when you're on social media things and people say, you put up some sort of a thing and they say, well, I've read the Bible and it clearly says God hates the gays or whatever, and you think to yourself, what do you expect? I have a PhD. I haven't read the Bible.
Yeah.
Get those kinds
What's
of things.
this Bible you talk of?
So, I write a lot of books, done about 30 or so. I'm taking notes for a future book in which one chapter I'm going to put comments that I've collected in the last month and a half of people calling me names and things, and I'm going to put in a chapter to say, this is how some people respond to these things.
I can't wait to read that.
Yeah. So, and that's, I laugh about it, but it does affect my mental health. Even though I try to let things roll off my back, it's not easy to do sometimes. So there's that really harsh and negative feedback. But the positive feedback has been overwhelming. And oftentimes it comes from people who are queer who say, finally, there's a group that I can be a part of and feel comfortable and be accepted. And they send me private notes and I connect them to others. There are allies who come forward. There are people who walk up to me at General Assembly who are leaders in the denomination and they say, Tom, I can't say this publicly, but I'm with you. And so that tells me there is a growing movement. There's a lot more people who are affirming than what may seem like on the surface. And so that's all encouraging.
That's awesome. I love to hear that. It's funny that you were talking about comments and stuff. I got one the other day. Somebody told me that the spirit of pride and homosexuality rule over me, and that I'm going to hell, basically. Yeah. I'm like, that's the first time I've ever heard that phrase. So I saved it. I screenshotted it and saved it. Because, yeah, I've got the spirit of homosexuality. So it's Pride Month. Let's all have the spirit, right? But anyway, that's awesome. Can you talk about that a little bit more though? I think that a lot of people, and I don't know if they're going to listen to this. I think the audience that we typically have are queer, or they're already affirming their allies. Really the other group that kind of listens that we hear from are those people that are kind of on the fence. They're still in church and they're still in firmly non-affirming churches, but they're struggling, right? I don't know what to think about this. I've always been taught this thing, but reality is different. And my queer friend, my queer relative, they're not evil. They're not, all of these things. And So can you kind of speak a little bit to that? You talked about this, like, theological overarching theme, and you wanting to live a life of love. What does that mean? I mean, when you talk about that, what do you mean when you say that?
I think a lot of people, when the queer issues come up and they come from a Christian background, they've been told and taught certain things. A lot of people will go to the Bible and they'll say, okay, well, what does the Bible have to say about this? And there are 7 or 8, depending how you count them, explicit passages related to same-sex relations. And those are oftentimes called the clobber passages because they've been used to harm and traumatize people. And so people will go to them and they'll say, man shall not lie with a man, or they exchange their natural desires for unnatural in Romans, etc. And there are ways to interpret those passages that I think one can come away thinking those don't apply to what we think about in terms of homosexual relations today. Then there's a whole group of passages in Scripture that are rarely talked about that address queer concerns, like Jesus talking about people who are born eunuchs and made eunuchs, or the Apostle Paul talking about nursing the children as a woman nurses her child. Well, there's talk about a gender transition there. So there's all kinds of passages that people like skip over that are queer affirming in a general way. And so what some people will do is they'll sort of put these two kinds of passages from Scripture on a balance and say, okay, which has more weight and that sort of thing. My approach is different. I say to myself, what do I think the overarching message of Scripture is, especially the message as articulated in Jesus? And to me, that message is a message of love. Now, love for me does not mean, hey, anything goes, do whatever you want, or what we call in philosophy extreme relativism. That's not love. Love is about well-being, health, wholeness. So I asked the question, can any kind of relationship, including same-sex relations, can they be healthy? And I think it's obvious that they can be healthy. I know people who are queer, who have healthy relationships with their significant others, their partners, etc. And so it's because of that claim, the claims of love as related to well-being, that I'm fully affirming. Now, I don't want to say that every queer relationship is healthy, just like I don't want to say every straight relationship is healthy. But I do want to say what I can see, the evidence of the lifestyle and lives of people, both straight and queer, is that same-sex relations can be healthy.
Well, I brought it up because, and maybe you guys can both speak to this. I can remember when we were talking about love within the church, and you could almost excuse any behavior by calling it love if I'm trying to save you from eternal conscious torment. And,
yeah.
And I can say horrible things to you, but it's because I'm trying to save you from this place. But that's not love, that's manipulation, and it took years coming out of that, and so I'm curious, because when you say life of love, it automatically goes back into my head like, okay, well, what are we talking about here? And of course I know where you're coming from, but I'm curious if you guys, I mean, wrestle with that, experience that, just that ambiguousness of when the church uses the word love.
Can I hit this
I think
first, Lex?
Oh yeah, go for it.
This is a crucial question, Joe, because people who have a different approach to this than me sometimes say, well, I'm being loving when I'm trying to get they'll say, homosexual friend to change, to be straight, to go through, recovery and therapy and all that sort of stuff. And what it comes across as is they saying to others, I have the good news and the answer. Now let me come fix you with your problem. And I think love, first of all, listens to the other, assesses where the other is at, doesn't come in with an agenda to place on the other. And if you begin from a place of listening, I think then your response can be much more healthy than coming in with your agenda. What do you think, Lex?
Yeah, definitely. I think this also makes me think of an essay in our book called Judging the Fruit. And I think we've spoken about this a little bit, that if you are coming at a person, trying to, I don't even know what the negative word is here, so preaching these really homophobic things, quote unquote, from a place of love, I think that you can't use your own perspective as an accurate sort of guideline for if this is successful or not. You have to look at the experience of the person on the receiving end. So, in this instance, the queer person, that the outcome here, is it a joyful, wonderful life full of, loving relationships, both romantic and familial, growing your community, or is it really the pain and trauma inflicted by these really homophobic stances? I wish I knew the numbers off the top of my head, but just the rate of suicidality amongst LGBTQ youth drops drastically by having a single affirming person in their life. And when you look at that fruit, that outcome, I think it's pretty clear. It doesn't matter what you're saying at the beginning. If you look at the outcome, the data shows that an affirming stance leads to better overall happiness and love. That's the outcome that's actually loving.
Yeah, I think the Trevor Project, I think their last study, and I could be wrong, but I think it drops 40% by having one loving, affirming adult in their life. Yeah. For us, that was the key. We went through all of those clobber passages and the Hebrew and the Greek and the historical and cultural context and stuff, but it was the teaching of Jesus and the tree and the fruit. And when we realized, in our culture currently, almost every negative experience that you can have is exponentially higher within the queer community, depression and suicidality and all of those things. But then when you added in church, those numbers were even higher. And for us, it was like, this can't be good fruit. I mean, the stuff that Jesus is talking about is not supposed to kill you. And so we're doing this way wrong. And that was, for us, outside of any kind of book, chapter, and verse, it was the human experience and the stuff that the church is saying and believing and teaching. And if it's driving kids to kill themselves, if it's driving people to do those things, it can't be good. It just can't.
Yeah, let me say something controversial here if I haven't already. I think at base for many of these issues is the questions of the afterlife. If you believe in a literal eternal hell, then just about anything is justifiable in the present life to keep people from going to that hell if you think they're going to go.
100%.
And so you can inflict all the trauma. You can feel justified inflicting as much trauma as you want on someone who's gay if you think it's going to save their soul from eternal conscious torment. So there are theological issues here that I think need to be addressed. I, for one, don't believe in a literal eternal conscious torment called hell. And that's not just because of the queer issues that I don't believe in that, but I think that working through those theological issues is essential if we're going to get past the end justifies the means of my, being harmful to this queer person.
Yeah, there's a lot to untangle. And it, for us, it was hard. It took a lot of years. Hell was a big one to untangle. I will say that Bart Ehrman's book, Heaven and Hell, was helpful for that, like understanding the historical, views of that. But I'll also say that your book, God Can't, was a big part of that. And then,
excellent.
And then you were talking about people listen to all of anything that you're listening to or speaking on podcasts to take notes. I did that for a season 2, but I wasn't emailing anybody. It was like listening about open and relational theology.
Okay, good.
So, yeah, I wasn't writing any hate notes, but but it is, when you can untangle that, when you can separate this God of love from, this medieval God that we've created. And then all of a sudden, if that's not a motivating factor, then I'm just free to just love you.
Yeah.
But that's it. I just want to be friends. I don't need to invite you to anything. I don't need to save you from anything. And the difference that makes.
It does make a difference.
So you guys talk about, the book, the conversations that are happening. I'm curious, and I don't want you to get in any extra trouble that you don't need to be in. Either one of you, Alexa, you get to be kind of secluded over there, which is awesome. But I just imagine that this is just a real thorn in the side for a lot of leaders, and that just wish that this would go away. And have you all been able to have any conversations on a higher level that gives any hope, or are you just kind of in that stages where you're just building this support, gathering people, people realizing that they're not alone in the fight? Is that where you're at, or is there actually higher conversations taking place yet?
There are higher conversations taking place. Most of them are private.
Right.
I would say all of them are private. I have great empathy for my district superintendent, and in our denomination we call them general superintendents. We have 6 of them. They are over the entire world in the denomination. I have great empathy for them, even though I'm a thorn in their side, because I realize that they're in a position in which there are people who with really strong feelings on both sides of this debate. And it's not easy to be a leader when you have people who are as divided in such passionate ways on issues. Now, as empathetic as I am, it doesn't mean I'm going to back down, because I think what I'm doing is what love requires. And I have in mind queer people who are traumatized and harmed. And I think the church is often the primary harmer, the perpetrator of that trauma. But I think I can both push the ways of love in terms of changing the denomination stance and feel sorry for leaders who are in the midst of people who are angry at me for what I'm doing. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It does. And I didn't want you to dive into any actual conversations that are taking place, but I was curious as to if it had started reaching higher levels, if conversations were happening about those kinds of things. Alexa, I'm curious, you're not within the denomination itself anymore. But I would imagine that you're still having conversations, that people are still reaching out to you. What kind of impact are you seeing, the book having on people that, obviously all these people wanted to jump in and be part of it, and they wanted to tell their stories and stuff. But what about the people that, maybe are just kind of on the outside looking in? Maybe they're not even Nazarene. Maybe they're not even, Christians or anything, but what kind of impact are you seeing just on general people that you guys are doing this?
Yeah, I would say there's sort of 2 camps there. One is, am I getting any reach out from folks within a church at all? And I would say no, largely because I think I've sort of made a pretty conscious choice to separate those parts of my lives. I want to be intentional in the ways that I choose to engage back into this conversation in with the church. And so I haven't really made myself available for those types of conversations, which has been, what I needed. But it is really great to, let me put it this way, being a part of this conversation and making the Nazarene Church a safer space for queer kids feels like I'm helping to create, even from a distance, even somewhat removed, a future for, me as a teen, but now coming up, and so even though I'm not sort of back in the trenches, so to speak, yet again, I can see people like me feeling so much more welcome and finding their own little places. And I think that part of the beauty of this book and this movement is leaving room for every person where they're at. We had people who we invited to write to this book who felt like they couldn't because it was just too emotionally traumatizing or for safety reasons, etc. There are people who in the book end up of a place of hopelessness, that there is no future for the church. They're angry at the church and don't want to be a part of it. And there's people who have found real community and have found healing in the church. And we wanted to really make sure there was room for all of those different sort of ending points. The other thing I would say about sort of people who talk to me about this stuff outside of religion, I have long joked when people ask me about the church I grew up in. I say, number one, it's like I grew up in the town from Footloose because Nazarenes don't dance. But I also say, people ask, what's Nazarene? And I say, well, we're like Methodists, but they hate the gays, kind of like tongue in cheek. And the nice thing is, now that this book is happening, I have amended that, sort of ironic statement. And it's fun to be able to say, oh, yeah, on the books, this is how it is, but this is some really encouraging change. And I think it's helpful for folks who are not evangelical or even Christian to sort of understand that evangelical Christianity is more nuanced, more evolving, more people focused, that things are happening there and we're not just a monolith, and that, queer folks are, first of all, there are evangelical queer people, and second, that we're fighting for some sort of change here.
Now, Alex, I got a follow-up question for you. Just as a queer person, and you grew up in the church, and thankfully you had a different experience at home than a lot of people did, and maybe one day your experience will be the norm and not the other way around. That's kind of the hope. But how does it, can you speak to just how, kind of growing up in those spaces, I'm assuming that you still heard some very maybe not nice things from pulpits. Can you speak to, for anybody that's listening that doesn't have that personal experience with that, can you speak to that just a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's dehumanizing. Growing up, never heard the church talk about queer issues, except, when some people would get up to give a homophobic testimony. And I think I suspect that a lot of my youth pastors and leaders were affirming, but didn't feel like they could be, or, at least on the more affirming side, didn't feel like they could be so vocally. And I understand that tension. That's really hard. But at the same time, it was a real sigh of relief coming home from church. And Dad will probably laugh about this, remembering, but we would always, on the way home from church, sort of deconstruct the Sunday school lesson and be like, all right, let's talk. Yep. Maybe not.
Man, it must have been really nice to have a dad who's a theologian.
Yeah.
That's a kind of ace in the pocket right there.
Absolutely. But sort of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning about, that Tom had worked through these issues and became affirming before I was even born, and how that really influenced my home perspective. Never was it even a question. Like, I didn't even feel like I had to have this big announcement of coming out to my parents, because from the beginning it was just, if you marry whoever, or it just was always an option on the table. And I think that not having that at church was so hard. But if you are a person who is maybe on the fence or starting to feel really convicted about being affirming, I think it can be really easy to sort of shy away from that scary abyss of, what do I do now? Have I been doing something, here I am telling you that you're harming people. That's hard to hear. And I think that the most loving thing you can do is to lean into that feeling, keep digging deeper, doing your research, exploring, listening to podcasts like you said you were doing, Joe, because the sooner that you change your mind on this, the sooner you can raise your children to not go through this trauma. I'm so grateful that from day one, my parents were affirming and it was never an issue. And like the sooner that you can get there, the greater your relationships will be with queer people going forward.
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, that's yeah. I'm glad you
Can
said
I share?
that. Yeah,
Can I share something,
absolutely.
Joe? Like one of the things I've been wrestling with and wondering, thinking that maybe I did a bad job of parenting, is remaining in a denomination and taking my kids to a church that wasn't fully affirming, that couldn't be out. I think Alexa's right that a lot of her youth workers, Sunday school teachers, maybe even, were secretly affirming, but they could never be that out in public, or at least they were sympathetic to the affirming side.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to myself, Tom, did you screw up not leaving this group of people, not finding a different denomination? Were you so intent on fighting for change in the denomination that you didn't think seriously about taking your kids to, I don't know, some other church that could, the UCC church down the street or wherever? I don't know how to answer that. I feel badly about that.
Well, I'll say from my perspective, I don't think you should feel badly about that. I don't think you made the wrong choice. I think that you and mom worked really hard to balance the sort of inputs that we were getting and to leave room for us to question. I mean, obviously, I'm no longer a part of the church, but that is totally fine. I feel like, we're at a good place with that too. And I don't think that you should see that as a failure. In fact, I think on the other hand, I think that we grew up then seeing you guys have a real commitment to your community and to your people and to changing this. And if we had grown up in, say, a UCC church, I could see a world in which I viewed conservative evangelical Christians like, some of my non-Christian friends do. It's sort of a caricature, laughing at them, And then instead I got this really personal, up close view, and I've grown to care about this community and seeing you fight for this community. So I think that you made the right choice.
Makes me feel a little better. Thanks, Alexa.
Well, I was going to say, when you guys were talking, and I think, Alexa, you were the one that was saying it. You mentioned, it was you mentioned somebody listening, hearing how their theology can create harm. And that's a hard thing to hear. And I will say that throughout this entire conversation, it's a tough topic. It's a tough thing to talk about. Number one, but number two, if you're still on that, non-affirming ish, wherever you're at, and you're hearing these things, it's hard to hear that. But the empathy that comes across in the way that you all are talking about this, I think makes an impact, because that was one of the important things for me. Was I chose authors, I chose speakers that I didn't feel like I had to be defensive when I was listening to them, because I wanted to learn, and I knew that I needed to learn. I just didn't want to feel like somebody was stomping on me or attacking me for wanting to learn. And the way that you all talk about this, and I think that's really, I wanted to bring that out because, Alexa, I had never heard anybody say that had you grown up in a different space, you might have seen this group of people now as a caricature, which is what's happening anyway. But if we just feed into that negative cycle, then nothing happens, right? Like, that's not the way of love. That's not what we're talking about. So I just wanted to make sure that was pointed out, that empathy and actual living out that way of love was that was noticed.
And I'll say, not to plug the book, but one of the things that I think turned out so one of the things that I think turned out so well in the book is that we very particularly from the beginning did not define what it means to be affirming. because we really wanted to take in a variety of perspectives, a variety of sort of locations in the affirming, quote unquote, big tent. And so because of that, I think there is a place, an entry place for every single person in this book. And if you read through it, and you maybe are in your beginning stages of exploring what it means to be affirming, some of those essays are going to feel like, that negative, like just hitting you with the hard stuff and make you feel bad. But I think it's important to sit with that and acknowledge if that's that person's experience. But on the other hand, there are points in this book that maybe you will relate to much more and feel like this is something that I feel seen and represented in this book. So we really wanted to not sort of, make some sort of high bar. You must be this affirming in order to enter the book. But to really sort of give a picture of, if you are affirming, if you identify as affirming, we want you as part of this conversation so that we can show how all the different ways that you can be affirming.
That's one of the things that's come up quite a bit, Joe, is in social media. People push me. They want to say, okay, what does affirming mean? And then they want to bring out all these, well, what about polyamory? What about this? What about that? Sex with cats or whatever, and my response is always, well, we're talking about what's healthy. But even that is not real specific, right? Like healthy is also at least partly subjective. So it gets people feeling uncomfortable, because a lot of the people who are not affirming live their life by black and white sets of rules. And you got to get these things all lined up just right. And for sure this is in and this is out. And when I come to you with live a healthy life, and that's kind of nebulous, they're like, what? Where are those, black and white sort of pegs that I can put everything in? So part of this exercise is not just about queer issues. It's about living a life in the midst of some ambiguity. And that's hard for a lot of people to wrestle with.
Oh, I can attest to that. That's not easy. Yeah. Understanding that God is mysterious and it's a mystery, and we see through a, mirror darkly, or whatever, however it's worded, versus the certainty that I grew up with, which was so easy and comforting and was like a nice warm blanket but then you find out, wait, this warm blanket's infested with all kinds of nastiness. And anyway, well, how do people get a hold of your book? How do people get a hold of it? Because I will say, I'm not Nazarene. I didn't grow up Nazarene. I grew up in one of the million Baptist denominations. But I have found that the book is worth reading whether I'm Nazarene or not. So how do people get a hold of it?
Well, what's the old line where the book is available wherever fine bookstores or whatever you can get it? I mean, the Amazon is the place where most people are going to go.
Okay.
But you can get it in other places as well.
And we'll link that in the show notes too, so that people can just click it and go to it.
Thanks.
I would also turn people to our website, lovingnazarenes.com, in which we are posting every single essay in the book as a blog post for free. So if you want to dip your toes in, poke around, find some essays that maybe feel really resonant with you, check it out. We're posting them, I think, 3 times a week. So I think they're not all up there yet, but we've got a good chunk of them. So you can start perusing.
So that's Loving Nazarene or Nazarenes?
Nazarenes, plural.
Okay. All right. I'll make sure that that's in there as well so that people can click that. And I think that's awesome that you guys are making it so accessible for people, because maybe not everybody can, purchase the book, but they can go to the website and start reading those essays and stuff too. I think that's important.
There's also Forrest Fisk is reading the book and it's on YouTube. So if you like to, listen to your material, you can get it that way. And, part of our strategy here, Joe, is that we want to change the denomination's view. We want to have conversations. So we put it on this website so that we could share these on social media to get people thinking. So if folks go to that site, they see something they like, please share it on your social media feeds.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to end our time, and I want to ask you guys a question. Maybe it's related to the book, maybe it's related to the work that you're doing. It doesn't have to be. I want to know what you guys are, where you're finding hope right now. What are you hoping for?
This is not related at all. I really love science fiction. And there's a lot of really cool science fiction happening right now. I would turn sort of two genres. There's solar punk and there's Afrofuturism, both are which of which are taking sort of alternative, against the grain approaches to thinking about our future, thinking about, ecological collapse, but also where do we go from here,
Mhm.
and finding community in that. And that's a very tangible hope, even though it's sort of silly. I like to spend my free time imagining beautiful futuristic worlds in which we're all growing plants on another moon colony and loving community.
Hey, listen, you are kind of speaking some of my language. I'm a big science fiction person. I love dystopian future kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
I'm rereading the Red Rising series because the next book, I don't know if you've ever heard of that one. Well, we won't get into it, but I love all that kind of stuff too. So I love it.
I think I'll give my answer more related to the book and the project. The statistics show that people under the age of 40 are far more affirming on LGBTQ issues than people over 40.
Mm-hmm.
And that bears out in my own experience as college students, 20-year-olds, etc., come up to me and say, thank you for this book and for what you're doing. This gives me hope that I could stay in the denomination or still be a Christian or whatever. So what gives me hope is hearing the testimonies of younger people as they wrestle with the queer issues.
That's awesome. Yeah, we find the same thing down here in Florida. Gen Z, they're going to save the country again. And so we're finding the same thing. But before we wrap up, maybe Alexa, you don't want to be found, and that's totally fine. But if somebody wants to reach out to you guys, maybe it's just to say thank you or resources or whatever, how do they find you? Maybe on social media or website or email or whatever you want to give.
Alexa, why don't you give the Sacrasage spiel?
Sure. So this book is published through Sacrasagepress, which is run by Tom and myself, and I'm actually stepping down, and our friend Jonathan Foster is also going to be publishing with us. And we publish a bunch of books on there, but we are mainly publishing small, independent, sort of theological, often open relational sort of veined books that are sort of don't have a home in traditional publishers, including books like this one, So you can visit our website at sacrasagepress.com or shoot me an email, or Tom and Jonathan at sacrasagepress@gmail.com. And that's SACRASAGE press.
Got it.
And you can find me on socials, but my email address is tjoord@nnu.edu. I direct a doctoral program in open and relational theology, and just Google my name. It's a weird one, OORD. You'll find me some way.
Yeah, I think you're the only one. Yeah, I think you're the only one. But hey, listen, this was a real pleasure. Thank you guys. Thank both of you for being a part of this, taking time out of your day to share about what you're doing and the impact that it's making. And our hope and all of our hopes and prayers are with you all, because just like you all, we think that inclusive spaces not only save lives, but we just think it's an actual picture of the diverse kingdom of God. So thank you both very much.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure.
Yes. Well, that was another episode of Shift Happens. Thank you all for following along. If you are wanting, to get a hold of that book, or to contact them, you can check out the show notes because all the information is there. Thank you again for following along. Now get out of here and go love on some people.